Hello everyone, Bag here, and welcome to my complete Phainon guide. Here, we'll take a look at his teams, his builds, his playstyles, and his premium options, so that you can leave this video as a more informed player and puller than when you got here. Timestamps are below if you don't need a kit summary, and with that, let's get into things. Phainon is a 5-star physical destruction unit with an incredibly unique kit. He revolves around concentrated bursts of damage with a high ramp up time that needs to be worked around. So then, let's get into his kit. The first thing you need to know about Phainon is that he has a unique ult gauge. It has a max of 12 stacks needed to ult, but in the same vein as Acheron, he can overcap to a total of 15. He starts combat with 1 stack, and otherwise he gains 1 stack from being targeted by an ally ability, 1 stack when being targeted by an enemy, 2 stacks when using his skill, which is just a normal blast attack with pretty high scaling, and lastly 1 stack when he is given energy by an ally. Kinda confusing since he doesn't have energy, but whatever. To clarify, being targeted just means having a reticle on Phainon for an ally's ability. Look at Ron May's skill versus her ult. Her skill doesn't target allies, but her ult does. So then her ult gives a stack to Phainon. Oh, and also his basic does nothing, by the way, but you probably guessed that. At 12 stacks, Phainon can ult, where a lot of things happen. First of all, Phainon creates a territory, which is the same thing as Castrus's Dragon's Field. You can't have 2 territories at the same time, so for now, that just means that you can't Phainon ult while Castrus's dragon is alive, as if that matters. This territory ejects all allies from the field while freezing their action value. And if you Phainon ult during an ally's turn, then that turn is forcefully ended, since, they got ejected from the field. With only Phainon on the field, he then takes 8 turns within this territory. These turns have a fixed amount of action value between them, proportional to the duration of this territory. Basically, he just has a solo Robin ult that his turns are evenly spaced within. So a faster ult speed results in a shorter amount of time between his 8 turns, and vice versa. The territory's duration is based on his base speed, so speed substats, buffs, or speed boots don't affect this. Only base speed buffs can, which is basically limited to premium options. It is also important to note that these 8 turns are quote extra turns, which is the same thing as Seelay's Resurgence, the start of a Rapper ultimate, or the turn that uses Maiday's extra enhanced skill. That is to say, buff timers don't count down on Phainon during these extra turns. Whatever buffs are on Phainon when he ults, they'll stay on him for the entire territory. Within this territory, Phainon gets massively buffed. A bunch of HP, a lot of attack, he restores 20% of his max HP with every attack, all enemies are given physical implants, and he is immune to CC. So then, what does he do in these 8 turns? Well, Phainon gets another unique resource, called Scourge. Yes, it's not called Bruise anymore, here's me reacting to the livestream on my Discord. Scourge is basically his unique version of skill points within his territory. You can have up to 7 Scourge at one time, where he gets 4 by using his ult, he gets a starting 2 from his technique for his first ult, and Scourge stacks also carry over between ults. So if you end a territory with 3 stacks, you'll start the next one with 7, since you then get an extra 4 from ulting for a second time. Phainon has 3 moves in this territory, that all revolve around generating and consuming Scourge for big damage. His first move is a very basic blast attack that generates 2 Scourge. His second move is a bit more complicated. Phainon enters into a counter stance, while action advancing every enemy on the field. When he does this, he gains 1 Scourge per enemy that he just action advanced. Every enemy then takes their turns attacking Phainon. This counter stance that he enters reduces the damage that he takes, while also counting every time that he gets attacked. This tally then strengthens the eventual big counter that Phainon releases after every enemy attacks. So TLDR, you action advance the enemies, they hit you, and then you counter. Simple. His third and final move is what consumes these Scourge stacks. It's a bounce attack ability where each Scourge stack consumed adds 4 bounces to the move. You can consume up to 4 Scourge at once, and unlike someone like Dill, you're forced to just consume as many stacks as you have when you use this move. If you consume 4 Scourge in one move, then Phainon adds on a gigantic finishing attack that, quote, is evenly distributed to all enemies. This works the same as Cypher's ultimate, so its damage is spread based on the amount of enemies hit. This move is also a self-cleanse, but he's already immune to CC, so that's not too impactful. So he spends 7 of his 8 turns gaining and consuming Scourge, but his final 8th turn is different. Phainon automatically launches an exit attack that is also evenly distributed to all enemies. This finishing move is also activated early if Phainon drops to 0 HP, where its scaling is weakened per extra turn left in the territory. Either way, the territory is then disbanded, his allies come back to the field with a 1-turn speed boost, and the cycle repeats. There is then a couple of last parts of his kit that I need to go over. For one, his talent gives him 30 crit damage when an ally targets Phainon, which will literally always be up. His minor traces give him crit damage, crit rate, and 5 speed, so his stats on the stat page will look pretty nice. His first trace, as mentioned earlier, gives him 1 starting ult stack at the start of combat, while also giving him 3 ult stacks when his territory ends. So after his first ult, he only needs 9 stacks to get every ult past his first one. His second trace gives him 45 damage percent when being shielded or healed by an ally. This is to incentivize running sustains on Phainon, but for now, it's not enough to justify actually running a sustain. And sustainless Phainon is his standard core. His final trace gives him a stacking attack buff. He gains 1 stack when entering combat, and another when his territory ends. So by the end of his first ult, this will have 100% uptime, so there's really not much to consider here. Finally, his technique is pretty important. Firstly, it insta-kills small enemies, like Acheron's technique. He raises the max technique point cap to 8, and his technique costs 2 points to use. When Phainon enters battle, he gets 2 Scourge for his first ult, as I mentioned earlier, an extra skill point, and 25 energy to all allies. This can lead to very consistent turn 1 ults for certain allies, like Bronya or Robin, which can massively improve the reliability of his initial rotation, especially with that extra skill point as well. For talent level priority, I mean, he's a carry, so you do want to eventually level everything to get the most damage out of him. Leveling his basic actually does affect the scaling of the blast attack in his territory, so yes, it is worth leveling as well. So, despite having a very overloaded kit, Phainon's game plan is actually relatively simple. There are 2 phases with Phainon, getting into his ultimate and spending time within the ultimate. Since he spends action value within his ultimate, spending more action value to get into the ultimate can lead to him bleeding cycles here and there, more than the average carry if you aren't careful. To get his ultimate very quickly, you want double action advancers, or just good ult stack generators in general. Oversaturating his buffs with damage percent and crit is worth it, so long as it, again, means getting him into his ultimate as fast as possible. These action advancers should be in a hyperspeed setup, dragging Phainon up to constantly skill, since Phainon skilling gives 2 ult stacks, which makes it incredibly useful to spam. For a baseline example, the default core of Sunday and Bronya gives him a total of 9 stacks with their skills and ults, so that plus his starting 1 stack means that he needs an extra 2 stacks to get into his first ultimate. This can be done through his last teammate or through enemies targeting him, but either way, it's important to ult on Phainon when he has all the relevant buffs on him. This in large part means lining things up to ult off of Bronya's turn to keep her skill damage percent buff up, but it can also apply to other things as well, such as if you can manage to Phainon on early enough to keep Sunday or Bronya's technique buffs into his first ult. Really, what you'll realize with Phainon is that he is extremely thresholds based. Whether or not he can get into an ult can entirely rely on an enemy targeting him or not. Whether or not he needs to work towards an entire extra ult in a fight can just be because he's a tiny bit off of finishing a fight off within a territory's duration. I've called Phainon a stat check unit before, and this is mostly why. He's not like other units, where doing 20% more damage means clearing 20% faster, or something approximate to that. Instead, if an extra percent amount of damage causes him to clear 1 ult sooner, then that's a huge clear speed improvement. But if not, then clearing in 1 or 2 territory turns faster is not nearly as impactful of an improvement. There are ways to try and shorten the action value that you bleed in this ult stacking downtime. The all-reliable DDD is an obvious one, and the same goes for Eagle or Von Wax shenanigans, but Robin's ult is another example. Since you freeze the action value of allies with Phainon's ult, you can keep everyone at 0 action value from the start of a Robin ultimate, and have them at 0 action value right when Phainon's territory ends. This then greatly shortens the time it takes to stack a second ultimate, but this also then means that Robin's ult has its full duration left, since its action value also then gets frozen. So getting Phainon's second ult within Robin's first ult should be pretty easy. And speaking of using Robin in the 4th team slot, as I mentioned earlier, sustainless Phainon is the default comp for him. This is because since he ejects his allies from the field, and he has his own form of sustaining himself within his own territory, that his allies are then less susceptible to be hit by enemies, and their sustaining for Phainon is not really needed. Instead, damage amping to make up for Bronya and Sunday's buff shortcomings, or an extra source of stack generation, would both be better for his clear speed. Within his ultimate, things are pretty simple. You build up Scourge with the blast attack or counter, and consume it with the last move once you have 4 Scourge built up. The counter is situationally worth using against 2 or 1 enemies, but when there are 3 or more enemies on the field, constantly countering is then the best way to gain Scourge, so long as he can live whatever the enemies throw at him. It's also important to take into account the enemy's rotation of attacks. Since you want to minimize how much damage your allies take, action advancing the enemy to act within Phainon's territory can be a good idea, if it then means Phainon takes a big AoE hit for himself instead of alongside the rest of the team. Same goes for avoiding annoying mechanics, since Phainon is immune to CC, and since his turns are fixed, he also can't be slowed. You can also exploit things such as forcing the Aventurine Dice minigame to target Phainon since he's the only one on the field, which can then give him an instant second ult. But really, there is isn't too much important decision making to be made within his ultimate. Part of what makes Phainon relatively simple to play in practice is that ejecting his allies off the field just gives him less options to consider. When he's in his big damage window, there aren't any niche team synergies to take advantage of. It's just him and the enemy, duking it out through his 8 extra turns. Both phases of Phainon have relatively simple game plans, and so long as your team can stack Phainon's ult quickly enough before they die from the lack of a sustain, you'll probably do just fine at a baseline. The last quirk I'll note is that unlike Robin or Aglaea's ultimate timers, Phainon's territory timer doesn't reset between waves. He gets 8 extra turns per territory no matter what. This means that how many turns you take in the first wave directly impacts your second wave performance. If you clear the first wave incredibly quickly, you'll then have more attacks left for the second wave before the territory ends. This can actually be a bad thing, as spending too much action value within the first territory can then mean that your supports might not be able to get you into your second ult within a certain cycle. If the start of a second Phainon ult is what you need to clear within a cycle of MOC, then coming into the second wave with 4 or better yet 3 Phainon turns left will make this plan actually feasible, since that makes the ult building downtime from the rest of your team happen earlier in the action bar. With this, it's also important to keep your supports about as fast as you can make them. This is important, firstly, so that Phainon can get his first ult early enough in the first wave to have enough territory moves within the first cycle to clear the first wave. But it's then also important so that when Phainon exits his first ult in that second wave, the supports are fast enough to be able to act within the first cycle. You can also do Eagle Von Whack shenanigans in the first wave to get even more stacks when going into his first ult, which can then shorten the ramp up time to his second ult, but if you don't want to deal with that, then I frankly wouldn't blame you. Phainon is all about losing action value consistently, whether through inside or outside of his territory, so it's your job to minimize what action value you can control to get his shortest possible clears. A plug here to subscribe. We are close to the 3.5 content cycle for Eidolons and Saraydra, so if you want coverage for them in this style, then stick around. Also, I just want to point out the amount of returning viewers that I have. That's a lot of people. So if you're one of the many people that consistently watch my content but you haven't actually subscribed, well, I can't do anything about that, but it would be cool if you did. Anyways, back to the vid. Right, now we get to how to build Phainon, which I think is pretty simple. He has a relic set that is made for him, Wave Strider, so that's a no-brainer to slap onto him. For Planar, he also has one made for him, Arcadia, although here it's basically even with Rutilant, so this is more of a substat diff, but since Arcadia isn't even out yet, odds are you probably have better Rutilant to use with him. For stats, physical damage for the orb is pretty obvious, as he is very oversaturated in attack due to his territory's buff, but you can still go attack orb, again, if it has noticeably better substats. Attack rope since he doesn't have energy, and a crit body for whatever gets you closer to an acceptable 1-to-2 ratio. For boots, I would generally recommend attack boots. Speed boots are usable as it lets you go faster than your action advancers, which then means more stack generation through the extra skill usage. But in order to do this, you need to massively slow down your supports so that Phainon is even capable of being faster than them. As I previously mentioned, the faster your supports are, the less action value it takes to build up his ult. So if the extra skill from speed boots isn't needed to get him into an ult within a threshold, then attack boots are just better. I would say a -1 speed setup with speed boots is a more comfy setup, but I would expect it to be slightly slower most of the time. Now for light cones, he is advantaged in being a destruction unit, which means he has the Hertastore Fall of an Aeon as a great free-to-play option. Thanks to his physical implant, the condition for this light cone is easy to proc, and a 2-turn buff will then be kept for the entire territory. Now he is very oversaturated in attack, and somewhat also with damage percent thanks to Bronya, Sunday, or if you use a sustain with them, but either way it is still good free stats. The 3.4 Battle Pass option, a Trail of Bygone Blood, gives a very simple 20 crit rate and 40 damage percent to skills and ultimates. This will end up as a marginally better option, but it's also 5 entire battle passes and 5 entire patches before you get the most out of it, so I personally wouldn't really recommend going for it if it's only for him to use. The obvious option is, of course, his signature. It gives 12 base speed, 60 damage percent with his ultimate, and 18% Def Shred. It also has a higher base attack than his other options, which I guess is worth noting. Def Shred is very impactful with how oversaturated he is in other buffs, but the real selling point is that extra base speed. This means that his territory's duration, instead of having a speed of 56.4, will now have a speed of 63.6. So putting it like that, yeah, that's not the most insane upgrade in speed, but with how his action value usage is the main bottleneck in his clear speed, any help in that area is greatly appreciated. This is one of only 2 ways to increase his base speed, the other way being his E1, which we'll get into later. For other 5-star destruction options, Dill's Light Cone can pull ahead of Aeon, assuming you are basic attacking into territory to max the passive out, which you probably won't be doing in high enemy scenarios like Pure Fiction. For teams, yeah, I think most of you already know, my most recent video goes into detail about all of his teammates. But for the TLDR, well, a lot of the the team building stuff was also covered in the playstyle section. The core is double action advancers, so Sunday and Bronya. RMC and Tingyun can work to replace Sunday or Bronya if needed, or they can be used as a 4th team slot to complete his necessary stack generation. Cypher, Chibi, Robin, or Van Mei are useful for their damage amp and respective utilities, and Sparkle is usable so long as you play around her buff timer, as her 50% action advance makes it hard to just slot her in as a Bronya replacement. Credit again for Chewy for this tech, but you can also just waste Sparkle's 50% action advance as a 4th teammate, if you just want to use her for buffs, stacks, and her SP generation. Lastly, for sustainers, you again don't need them most of the time, but Ho-Ho does give energy for an extra stack, and her attack buff is pretty easy to bring into the territory. Gallagher is also there for SP and skill spamming for ult stacks, I guess, but yeah, the general recommendation is to just run sustainless. Pretty simple team stuff, but I would also expect things to get a bit more complicated within the next 1 to 3 patches. As I've said before, Phainon feels a bit Acheron pre-Jiaoshu-y right now. That's mostly just speculation though, so take that with as many grains of salt as you want. Lastly, we have his Eidolons, which are very unique, I guess is the word for it. His E1, which seems to still have a mistranslation in English, increases the base speed ratio from his territory to 66%. Then, for every defeated enemy, that ratio gets increased by 1.5% up to a total max of 84% with 12 kills. He then also just gets 50 crit damage. This is mostly going to pop off in Pure Fiction, as in other modes it's unlikely to really max this out, or get much use of the increased speed with how fast the fights can go. Pure Fiction is where you mostly aren't restricted by clearing within certain cycles, and it's instead all about doing the most within the total amount of cycles that you're given. This, plus the fact that you'll get to 12 kills pretty easily, makes this Eidolon massively impactful for this mode. Also, yes, this increased speed ratio does carry over between territories, so once it's maxed out, it'll stay that way for the rest of the fight. The basic recommendation is usually his S1 is more important overall, thanks to its larger damage amp and more universally applicable speed boost as opposed to being restricted by a scaling kill count. But his E1 isn't bad by any means. Mostly though, his E1 is valuable as it gets you closer to his E2. His E2 makes it so that whenever you consume 4 Scourge, so whenever you do that big meteor attack, you get an extra turn. This extra turn is not a part of the 8 extra turns that makes up his territory's duration. It's just a free extra turn. Oh, and also you get 20 respan, just as an added bonus. Like E1, this Eidolon's value is pretty fight dependent, since his optimal method of Scourge generation depends on the amount of enemies on the field. But yeah, this is entirely an E2 dill, E2 the Herda level of good carry E2s, and it's generally also way better than E1S1. Again, I would recommend looking at what his future teammates look like before going all in on his E2. But in isolation, yes, it is very good, but not needed to make him clear well. His E4 makes his counter give him an extra 4 Soul Scorch, which is the tally of how many enemies hit him during the counter. So his counter just gets an extra flat 80% scaling. E4s are usually just outright bad, this one's just eh. Finally, Phainon's E6 makes his ult stacks no longer have a limit of 15. You can now just stack infinitely. He now starts combat with 6 extra stacks, for a total of 7, and now his Scourge consuming attack now does 36% true damage to the enemy with the highest HP. So yeah, this Eidolon gives him a massive head start onto his ult ramp up, which can either free him up from double action advancing, so he can instead just have damage ampers to further push him to be able to clear in one ult, or his action advances can instead push him closer to 24 stacks, which then can lead to back-to-back ults, or something close to that. With his E1 shortening his territory's duration, this just further attempts to solve the problem of taking too much action value to really get going. It's a very good E6, but that's not entirely a surprise. And that's everything. I wish you all luck on your Phainon polls, and as for me, I'm gonna be live about an hour after this video comes out for the new MOC reset, so come by if you want to say hi. Anyways, with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye!